Anyway, hi everybody, we're back, and I'm so excited to have to speak to Makoto Fujimura. I think a lot of you probably are familiar with his work, and you see some of his beautiful painting behind him. And I guess you're in your studio there.
Yes.
And are you in Princeton?
I am in Princeton. Yeah.
In Princeton, yeah. And so Mako is a world-renowned painter. As you can see from this art, he combines abstract expressionism with Japanese traditional painting, Nihonga. Is that how you pronounce it?
That's correct. Yeah.
Nihonga. Oh,
That's
good.
correct. Yeah.
And he is a well-known speaker and author, and some of his books are Refractions, A Journey of Faith, Art, and Culture, Silence and Beauty, Hidden Faith Born of Suffering, Culture Care, and then his most recent one is Art and Faith, A Theology of Making. You can get that on Yale University Press. It's out now. And yeah, just always a joy to hear you, to read you. So thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be here, Mary. Congrats on your book.
Thank you so much. I want to start just asking you something that I've been thinking about. I talked about a little bit in the book in regards to film, and even some kind of more avant-garde fiction. But I'm just thinking, when we think of empathy in art, we tend to think of narrative art. But I don't think it's just limited to that. And how does abstract art, you know, the way that the kind of art that you create, does that, do you hope that people have an empathetic response when encountering your art, or have you yourself, you know, had some powerful empathetic responses from viewing abstract art?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, by the way, I don't necessarily separate, you know, what's called abstraction with what's called representational. It's just a matter of focus on macro issues. But you know, works by Shusako or Mark Rothko, two artists that I highly, in fact, a lot of artists that I admire tend to create this inner scape of empathy. It's an invitation to understand both the tragic nature of life, but also they create hope by you know, paradoxically depicting that sense of despair. And so Gorky is not a well-known artist. Gorky, Ashio Gorky, was an Armenian artist who literally escaped the US as a child. His mother was killed in the genocide, and he kept on painting images of her initially, and then later on he was best friend of Willem de Kooning, who is most well known as an abstract expressionist. But Gorky was one of the first artists to have a studio dedicated to that he would commit to being a full-time artist in Union Square. And that sent this wave of shock among other peers, including de Kooning, to get their own studio and say, I'm an artist now, you know, kind of thing. And Gorky always had an understanding that art somehow can mediate trauma. And all of his paintings are about understanding, you know, that abstract language can get into the deep subconscious of reality of trauma and describe it in a way that is profound and beautiful. And, you know, obviously I also appreciate and have learned from Japanese masters of 17th and 16th century and on. But there's a Japanese term which you would be interested in. It's called mono no aware. Mono no aware means pathos of things. And it's a term that began to, you see it beginning in 11th century Japanese poetry, this idea that beauty is tied to sacrifice, or the cherries are most beautiful when they're about to fall, and die basically, and sunset's beautiful because the sun is burning, kind of, and human beings can have the capacity to tap in empathetically with something disappearing, something that is ephemeral.
Yes.
And so Mono no Aware is a perfect example. Tale of Genji is all about that sense of longing and lack, and having this heightened sense awareness of ephemeral nature of life and relationships and so forth. And so that's that is the first novel written in the world by a woman. So it's a very significant, I think, influence in what you're talking about in your book.
Yes. Oh, thank you for that.
Yeah.
I did not know the term, so I'll have to look up more about that. That is just fascinating. And I'm also thinking about how, well, I know you talk about slow art and slowing things down. And I'm thinking about too with abstraction. Well, I also found interesting that you say that you don't make a distinction between abstraction and representation.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, it seems like what we can typically consider abstraction, it takes more patience. It causes you to slow down and to contemplate, which then you realize, it's maybe it's not a quick access to quote representation or something. Is it about the act of slowing down?
Yeah, and all art is abstract, and all art is representation. It's a representation, representing the world, translating it in some way. And even if it's hyper realistic, what you're doing is you're representing the world in hyper realistic photorealism terms, right? So art is always about representing, even something as highly abstracted as de Kooning's work is representing the world. So I think there's this sense that in which we can tap into what art can do to give us a transformed perspective of what we see, and increasingly, I think science is more and more aware and tell us that we don't really see what we see. Our brains have learned to see certain things a certain way. What we think is normal is not really normative at all. It's very much built up through years of how we learn to in the context of even as a baby we're learning to place certain focus on certain things in order to make sense of the world, right? So artists are the type of creatures that see more in a sense, see before the categorization or kind of formation of a particular way of seeing takes place. Like they push back viewing into more raw terms, and so you're looking at, so it's not really abstracting, but it's really representing.
Yes. Well, and I'm just thinking about when you're talking about artists and the artist's way of looking, this is kind of a little shift, but it's something that really stuck with me. And I've said it multiple times in my classes. I heard you speak at a conference at Regent College with Steve Garber, who's our next guest.
On silence.
Steve. Yes. And I remember you talking about when someone was planting a church, that you would say that after the minister, you think that some of the first people that they should get make sure they have in the church are artists.
Yeah.
And you talked about the artists. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that was
Oh,
so
yeah.
fascinating. I want others to hear that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I always tell church planters and really entrepreneurs too. I tell that to board of companies, you have to have artists around, and by artists I mean not just visual artists, but poets and singer songwriters, theater directors, because they see the world in a more complex way, more nuanced and complex way. They don't accept the typical categories that we assume to be normative. So again, it goes back to perceptions, but artists are willing to experience the world in a wide open lens, and so you're really seeing something of a what we consider to be new paradigm shifts, and most of us are shocked by what may happen tomorrow, but artists are always anticipating that the world is always in a flux, and what we consider to be construction of normality is something to be suspicious of.
Yeah.
and pushing back against that, right? And so therefore when you're creating anything, church planting for example, when you're trying to understand a community and a cultural context through which you're trying to inhabit this gospel, Christian gospel, you can't have any assumptions about that culture you're inhabiting. You have to be willing to understand, which means to stand under, to the reality of culture, as Paul did, Athens in Acts 17, to understand the unknown poets and to begin to see the gospel through their lens. As you might be the one to communicate, this reality of God breaking into our world and then turning the world upside down, challenging authorities. I mean, that sounds like an artist, right?
Yeah. Well, it's the prophetic role of the artist.
Yeah, right. Prophetic. And so I've always noticed that whenever I go into a city or new culture, artists are the ones that are willing to, because they're border stalkers, they are able to meet you halfway in a way, if you have the right approach. And typical institution doesn't have a way to welcome that, right? You're almost creating this defense system, rather than exploratory team, of discoverers, and I think, church planting certainly needs to be this mission of exploration and discovery, but in some sense, the gospel movement is always that.
Yes.
Right. So you're not. There's never a point at which you sit comfortably in your tribal realms and say the world should come to us because we are right.
Yes.
Jesus doesn't take that route. John 10, Jesus is outside of the gate, taking his sheep outside of the pen, and I don't think it occurs to a lot of church members that there's something funny about being inside the church, because that's not how the gospel. You read through the gospels. When are they inside a church? On upper room, certainly, but that's in Jerusalem. Jesus about to be crucified.
Yeah.
So there's no kind of sense of comfort zone of, here we are, we can defend this territory. They're always moving.
Yes.
and they're always pilgrimage up to Jerusalem, and then after after Easter, they're being sent out into the world in this missional way. So that you're always discovering, and so that in that sense, I think artists are the ones most acutely aware of their role in the world, and ones that I think can map the terrains, so that the rest of us can journey there.
That's amazing. I mean, there's so much to learn from artists. And I also think that artists in this sense, and in the works I've talked about, and so many works, can teach, again, this is how they can teach us to be more empathetic. It's just teaching us to see, and have eyes, to have eyes to see and ears to hear. And well, this reminds me of your great love of Shusako Endo.
Yes.
And how you've written on silence, and even worked some with Scorsese on the film, consulting with the film. So I mean, this is a novel that really, I've taught it multiple times. It's a hard novel. It really gets down to the core. Yes, it really gets down to the core of what does this thing, being a Christian, really mean? But it also teaches us empathy, as we had mentioned a little in an email to me about how much we see a reflection of the power and the glory.
Oh, and the glory,
I mean, they're like very similar.
So when you can actually see the original manuscript of Silence that Endo wrote at the Shusako Endo Museum in Sotome, Nagasaki.
Really?
Yes, and literally in the side pages there are quotes from The Power and the Glory. He literally, I mean, this is like compare and contrast, like as he's writing his book, he wanted to, that was his mirror. And I don't know if you know this, Mary, but he had this habit of walking around places where some of his favorite authors have walked, and he would just travel to go there, and we'll walk around Paris near Sorbonne, or other places, and he was in London walking around, literally following after Graham Greene, and stayed at the hotel that Greene likes to stay at. And in the elevator, he ran into Greene.
Really?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
And he said, he couldn't say anything in the elevator, so he sent a note to Graham Greene saying that I am the author of Silence. You were kind enough to read it, and actually his endorsement. I think something like, Shusako Endo is one of the, great novelists of our time, or something like that. One single line that put Endo on the map. So he mentioned that I'm Shusako Endo, and thank you for giving me the amazing endorsement. And I would love to have a cup of coffee if you have time. And Graham Greene responded, and they spent time talking about their journeys. Endo's English was pretty good. He spoke French and English pretty well, so he would have had I would love to have been sitting on the fly on the wall for that. But I think what he would have said was, your book, The Power and Glory, was singularly the most important book in writing silence. It's literally, you can do studies on that.
Yes, and I mean, the quote from The Power and the Glory that is the most known quote in the prison with the whiskey priest, about hate being the failure of imagination, is one of the inspirations for the book that I wrote. Because
I when I read that, in your book, I thought about Endo, and I write in about Endo that despite what Silence and other books depict, it's a very difficult, traumatic story, but Endo is fundamentally, what is he after? Is he after nihilism and this kind of masochistic drive toward pain? No, he is trying to get at empathy,
Yeah.
in the way that Greene does,
Yeah.
in deconstructing the Catholic realities of what sacrament means, right, and what violence may mean. Endo's doing the same thing, and by the way, Scorsese does the same thing with his film. And people often misread that and say, well, it's something that Christians shouldn't read because it talks about apostasy and it talks about failures of faith, and in fact it does the opposite in my mind. We need it because it creates empathy in us to understand deeper the human condition.
Absolutely. I mean, that is, I've been talking about that all day, is, I mean, excellent art that really, art that helps us to be more human, is art that really shows the complexity of the human condition. And when I just did The Power and the Glory with students, and they actually found the novel pretty difficult. I mean,
Yes.
just the reading of it,
Yeah.
but the conversations it brought up were just, I think they were shocked to go so deep into a spirit conversation about what does it really mean to live as a Christian. Talking about that in the classroom, and they are reminiscent of the conversations I've had in the classroom on silence.
Yes.
I had someone stand up and crying and run out of the class once when we were reading Silence, because it just hits you in your core.
It does. It is. And I think, all of your authors that you mentioned in your book, actually, when you think about it, including Mr. Rogers, tend to create a world, in which it's prismatic. It's not this converging, neat conclusions that you can draw from what they say and what they do. It tends to open up. It tends to be generative, and I've been spending a little time with Jewish rabbis of late, and I co-taught a class at Duke with Ellen Davis, with Rabbi Shai Held, and to the rabbis who practice midrash, right? It's about disagreeing and arguing and over a passage, maybe even the word, and what that does is it creates this dissonance that forces truth to be refractive in and it's not about who's right and who's wrong, who wins and who loses. It's about us being awake to pay attention to biblical texts, really, but to understand how complex and nuanced every word can be. And that tradition is to me one of the most fundamentally critical roles of literature, learning to read with within this attention to understanding the refractive nature of language, and how hard communication can be, right? And we think communication is linear and propositional, and we say one thing and you receive another. But as we talked about, perception doesn't really work that way, and we have different categories and different experiences and different cultural language, right? To even for speaking in English, it doesn't mean we can agree on the set definitions of what language can mean. So impossibility of communication is what artists begin with. Right. And whereas a typical person will assume, I can communicate to you about this, why aren't you understanding me? But artists like Endo says, of course you don't understand me, and I'm going to make it even more difficult in order that we can communicate deeply.
But then it's real. It's real. And I love the way you're highlighting that, because I feel like there's a fear of dissonance, and especially in kind of mainstream Christian culture. Whereas, I mean, you're highlighting that dissonance can be a means to truth. You
Yeah.
know, it's kind of
Yeah.
like you're clarifying and
Yeah.
you're peeling back the layers, and it can be like an apocalyptic, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
moment. And so
Yeah.
I feel like these authors that we're
Yeah.
talking about, and artists such as yourself, I mean, it's just, I mean, and this is where artists are really in this prophetic sense, really leading the
Yeah.
way a lot, and we need to, you know, listen.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
well,
No, I think so.
sadly, I know, absolutely. Well, sadly, we've got to cut things short because I've got to go
Yeah.
Steve Garber's
Yeah. It's
he's
going to be
coming
on,
up
right?
next, and that's
Yeah.
going to be great. Yeah. But
On.
then again, I want to talk to everyone for 2 hours, so this is hard, but it just
Yeah. Well, maybe you should. You should
gives
create like a series of literature
exactly. Well, Joe
conversations.
Picasola and I are going to do a podcast, start a
Okay.
podcast. So we're
Good.
gonna we of course we want you to come on, and we can talk for a
Yeah.
long time.
Well, I look
But
forward to it.
but thank you so much, Mako, for
Absolutely,
joining
absolutely.
me. And it
Yeah,
was
congratulations again. It's a wonderful book, a much needed book on imagination and faith, which, as you know, is very important aspect of the theology of making. So,
thank you so much.
okay,
Bye.
okay.